There is a version of you that toxic people counted on. The version who forgave too quickly. Who stayed quiet when you should have spoken. Who kept coming back after every single time you told yourself this was the last time. They built their entire behavior around that version of you. They calculated, whether they admit it to themselves or not, that you would always be there, absorbing, adjusting, apologizing for things that were never your fault to begin with. And then, one day, without a dramatic scene, without a final confrontation, without even raising your voice, that version of you simply stopped existing. This is not a story about revenge. Revenge requires you to still be entangled with someone, still spending your energy on making them suffer. What we are talking about today is something far more powerful and far more stoic in nature. It is the quiet, internal transformation that happens when a person finally stops being available for their own mistreatment. And ironically, nothing makes a toxic person regret losing you faster than watching you become someone they can no longer reach. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the best revenge is to not be like your enemy. He did not mean this as a passive surrender. He meant it as the highest form of discipline. Because becoming your best self, entirely independent of the person who hurt you, is a transformation they cannot claim credit for, cannot manipulate, and cannot undo. Let's talk about why this works and exactly how to build it. The first thing to understand is that toxic behavior survives on predictability. A person who mistreats others, whether through manipulation, dismissiveness, cruelty disguised as honesty, or simple chronic disrespect, relies on knowing how you will react. They know which buttons to press. They know that if they apologize just enough, just convincingly enough, you will let the cycle repeat. They know your patience has always had one more inch to give. The moment you become unpredictable to them, not chaotic, not dramatic, but simply changed, the entire system they built around you collapses. This is often the first sign that a toxic person begins to feel the loss before they will ever admit it out loud. They test the old buttons. They wait for your usual reaction. And when it does not come, something shifts in them. Confusion. Then, slowly, an uncomfortable realization that the version of you they knew how to control no longer exists. The second principle is this. Detachment is not coldness. It is clarity. Many people confuse becoming unaffected with becoming cruel. This is a critical misunderstanding. When you stop reacting to someone's provocations, you are not punishing them. You are simply no longer offering your emotional energy as a resource for their behavior to feed on. Epictetus, another towering figure of Stoic philosophy, taught that we suffer not from events themselves, but from the meaning we assign to them. When someone insults you, mocks you, or dismisses you, the sting you feel is real, but the power you give that sting afterward is entirely yours to control. Toxic people often mistake your emotional reaction as evidence that they still matter to you. Every flinch, every defensive explanation, every attempt to prove them wrong, feeds a subtle sense of importance in their mind. Remove the reaction and you remove the fuel. Not because you have stopped feeling things, but because you have stopped performing those feelings for their benefit. The third principle, and perhaps the most difficult to accept, is that healing in silence is more powerful than confronting in anger. There is a strong temptation, especially after prolonged mistreatment, to want the final word. To deliver the perfect sentence that finally makes them understand what they did. To watch their face change as the truth of their behavior lands. This desire is deeply human and completely understandable. But it rarely satisfies the way we imagine it will. Marcus Aurelius reminds us, again and again in his private writings, that other people's actions are ultimately not within our control, but our own responses always are. Trying to force someone to acknowledge the damage they caused places your peace in their hands one more time. It requires their participation in your healing. And people who caused harm rarely offer the closure we hope for, because acknowledging it fully would require them to face themselves honestly, something many people spend their entire lives avoiding. Real closure does not come from someone else's confession. It comes from your own quiet decision to stop waiting for one. The fourth principle is about rebuilding, not proving. When someone hurts you repeatedly, there is an instinct to want to prove something. To prove you are fine. To prove you have moved on. To prove, sometimes indirectly through social media, mutual friends, or carefully positioned success, that you are thriving without them. This instinct, while understandable, keeps you tethered to their opinion of you. It means your growth still requires an audience that includes them. True transformation does not perform for anyone. It simply happens, privately, consistently, without an announcement. You start sleeping better because your nervous system is no longer bracing for the next conflict. You start enjoying small things again, a quiet morning, a good book, a walk without the weight of anticipating someone's next mood swing. None of this needs witnesses. And ironically, the less you try to prove your healing, the more visible it becomes to everyone around you, including, eventually, the person who caused the wound. The fifth principle. Boundaries are not built in one conversation. They are built through consistent, repeated action. Many people believe that setting a boundary means delivering one powerful speech, after which everything changes. In reality, boundaries are built the same way trust is built or broken, incrementally, through what you do the next time and the time after that and the time after that. If you tell a toxic person that their behavior is unacceptable, but return to old patterns the very next time they apologize convincingly, you have not built a boundary. You have built a longer runway for the same behavior to continue. Real change requires that your actions match your words every single time, even when it feels difficult, even when the apology sounds sincere, even when part of you desperately wants to believe this time will be different. The sixth principle is understanding the specific psychology of what happens when someone loses access to a person they mistreated. Human beings, even those who behave poorly, often operate on a subtle assumption of permanence. They assume the people around them will always be reachable in some form, even after conflict, even after distance. This is why the sudden, quiet absence of someone they once had full access to often creates a psychological disturbance far greater than any argument could. It is not necessarily love that creates this reaction. Sometimes it is simply the loss of control. The realization that a person they once predicted perfectly has become unreadable, unreachable, and entirely outside of their influence. This can trigger genuine reflection in some people. In others, it triggers frustration because their sense of power depended partly on your continued presence and reaction. Either way, your job is not to manage their reaction. Your job is to continue building a life so full, so aligned with your own values, that their reaction becomes irrelevant to your daily peace. The seventh principle. Stop narrating your pain to people who caused it. There is an exhausting habit many of us fall into, explaining our hurt directly to the person who created it, hoping that if we articulate it clearly enough, they will finally understand the weight of what they did. This rarely works because people capable of causing repeated harm are often the same people incapable, at least in that moment, of holding space for someone else's pain without becoming defensive. Redirect that energy. Process your pain with people who have earned the right to witness it, a trusted friend, a therapist, a journal, or simply your own quiet reflection. The person who hurt you does not need a play-by-play of your suffering in order for your healing to be valid. The eighth principle. Notice how your standards begin to rise once you are no longer negotiating with disrespect. One of the strangest side effects of finally releasing a toxic dynamic is discovering how low your baseline for acceptable treatment had quietly become. Once you are no longer surrounded by chronic disrespect, dismissiveness, or manipulation, you begin to notice these patterns instantly in others, sometimes for the first time in your life. This is not paranoia. This is recalibration. Your nervous system, having been trained for years to accept crumbs as meals, is finally learning what a full meal actually looks like. This shift alone is often the most undeniable proof that leaving was the right decision, because peace, once experienced consistently, becomes very difficult to trade away again. The ninth and final principle. You do not need them to regret it for your growth to be real. Perhaps the most liberating shift of all is releasing the need for the other person to ever acknowledge what they did, or to ever feel the loss the way you hope they will. Their regret, if it comes, is not something you can control, predict, or rely on. Some people never fully confront the damage they caused. Some spend years rationalizing it instead. Waiting for their regret as validation for your healing places your peace in permanent suspension, dependent on a reaction that may never arrive. The moment you stop needing their regret to feel complete, you take back the only thing that ever truly mattered, your own sense of worth, decided entirely by you. And here is the quiet irony in all of this. The less you focus on making someone regret losing you, the more naturally that regret tends to arrive, because nothing communicates loss more clearly than watching someone become fully, peacefully, unmistakably fine without you. Marcus Aurelius never wrote his private thoughts hoping his critics would one day feel sorry for how they treated him. He wrote them to remind himself daily that his composure, his growth, and his peace belonged entirely to him, regardless of what anyone else ever came to understand. That is the version of you being built right now. Not the version performing healing for an audience. Not the version waiting for an apology that may never come. The version who simply, quietly, undeniably moved forward. And that version does not need anyone's regret to know exactly what she or he is worth. There is a 10th principle worth adding here, one that rarely gets discussed because it requires a kind of honesty most people avoid. Sometimes the person you are trying to release is not entirely a villain in the story. Sometimes they are simply someone who never learned how to treat people well, who repeats patterns they themselves inherited from somewhere else, who causes harm not out of calculated cruelty but out of their own unresolved wounds. This does not excuse what happened to you. It does not mean you owe them more patience, more chances, more of your energy. But understanding this can quietly dissolve a certain kind of bitterness that otherwise lingers far longer than it needs to. Marcus Aurelius wrote something remarkable on this exact subject. He reminded himself that when people wrong us, it is often because they do not know what is good or bad in the way we have come to understand it. Not because they are monsters, but because they are, in his words, kindred, sharing the same capacity for reason, simply misusing it. This is not a call to forgive prematurely, or to minimize what happened. It is a tool, a way of loosening the grip resentment has on your daily thoughts so that the person who hurt you no longer occupies space in your mind rent-free. Let's talk about what this actually looks like in daily practice, because principles without practical application tend to fade the moment life gets difficult again. Imagine the version of yourself 6 months from now, fully recovered, fully rebuilt, living according to your own values rather than reacting to someone else's chaos. What does that version's mornings look like? What does that version's relationships look like? What boundaries does that version hold effortlessly, without needing to explain them to anyone? Start acting today as though that version already exists. Not by pretending you feel nothing, but by making decisions consistent with the person you are becoming, rather than the person who was shaped by mistreatment. This means, practically, choosing silence over explanation when someone from your past resurfaces looking for a reaction. It means noticing the impulse to check on them, to see how they are doing, to see if they have moved on faster than you have, and gently redirecting that impulse towards something that actually nourishes you instead. It means allowing yourself to grieve the version of the relationship you wished you had, even while firmly refusing to return to the version that actually existed. There is also an 11th consideration that deserves honest attention. Sometimes the desire to see someone regret losing you is actually a disguised desire for them to finally see your worth, something they consistently failed to do while you were together. This is deeply human and nothing to be ashamed of. But it is worth asking yourself a difficult question. If they finally recognized your worth tomorrow, would it actually change how you feel about yourself today? Usually, if we are honest, the answer is no. Because worth that depends on someone else's recognition was never fully secure to begin with. The goal then is not to make them see your worth. The goal is to build a version of yourself so rooted in her or his own value that their recognition becomes entirely optional. This is, in many ways, the deepest teaching Stoicism offers on this subject. Epictetus taught that some things are within our control and some things are not. Another person's regret, another person's growth, another person's ability to finally understand the damage they caused, all of this sits firmly outside our control. What remains entirely ours is how we choose to build our days, our habits, our relationships, and our internal narrative, regardless of whether the other person ever catches up to the truth. So here is the final reframe. Stop asking whether they will regret losing you. Start asking whether the version of you being built right now would be proud of how she or he handled this. Whether the discipline, the patience, the quiet strength being practiced today would make Marcus Aurelius himself nod in recognition. Because that question, unlike the first one, is entirely within your power to answer. And when you can answer it honestly with a quiet yes, you will notice something interesting. The need for their regret will have quietly, almost imperceptibly, disappeared. Not because you no longer care what happened, but because you have finally built something more valuable than their acknowledgement ever could have been. Your own undisturbed peace.